Hi everyone, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you from my home office, and with us today is Rambo. He is my rescue dog that we found up at the ranch, abandoned up there, and he has become a wonderful companion. So he's going to make sure that I do this right. So let's get to our topic today. We're going to be talking about the topic of perception. And so, whoops, whoops. There we go. I want to get the screen up there for you. Okay, here we go. Here's our outline. And let me get my own self off of the picture so you don't have to see me the whole time. All right. So in the last video, we talked about sensation, which is the ability to detect various types of stimulus energies in our environment. Perception goes hand in hand with that. Perception being the process of organizing, analyzing, and interpreting sensory information. So it's taking that information brought in by our senses, our eyes, ears, sense of touch, and so forth, and organizing it into some meaningful patterns, making an analysis of just what that represents and interpreting what that means for us. So this is the process then of extracting meaning from complex stimuli. So for example, we might have all of these light particles that are being picked up by our visual system. So what does that pattern of light particles represent? What object is it? And then going from there, just what does that object mean to us? And also looking at it in terms of what does that imply for our actions? Does that mean we need to do something or change something? So all of this really ties into how we actually are going to proceed. Notice that perception then involves also making an analysis at a level that is appropriate for the situation. And you're going to see how that comes into play in just a moment here. So that guides us in terms of how we actually process the sensory information. So we're going to be looking at two processes here next. We have the bottoms-up approach to processing information and the top-down approach. And let's illustrate that. I'm going to flash something on the screen real quick, and I want you just to blurt out what you saw on the screen that was there for that moment. So here we go. Okay, did you blink and miss it? Hopefully you didn't blink while it was there. What did you see? Most people will say, I saw maybe a horse or a person on a horse. A few people might say, well, I saw some rocks. Maybe some people will even say, I think I saw a stream. But those are going to be the typical things that will be observed with just a very brief exposure to a stimulus. This is an example of top-down processing, and this is where we make a very rapid but very quick appraisal of that particular stimulus, and using just an instant pattern recognition, we pick out certain patterns as being meaningful whole objects. So this is a very rapid process. We don't have to have exposure to that sensory information for very long to do this. And it's sort of intuitive. In other words, it doesn't really require any thought on our part or conscious effort. So top-down processing, very fast. Have a look here. Let's have a closer look at it. Okay. There we go. As you look closer at the picture, do you see any other things? And as you look closer at it, many of you will begin to pick out various faces that can be sort of mentally constructed, if you will. Here's another one. Every time I look at this, I see a few new ones that I haven't seen before. And so what we're doing here is a different type of processing that is known as bottom-up processing. So we're building up that image from by putting together details. We're assembling specific details to build that image sort of like from the foundation up, if you will, from those details. Now notice this is an analytical type of processing. We have to analyze that sensory information with some conscious effort in order to then actually make some sense of it. Also notice this process requires us to encounter that stimulus for somewhat longer period of time. So these two processes also can be illustrated here. Here's two guys. Who are they? Okay, and even though it's been a few years, most of you will recognize that the guy in the front was one of our former presidents, one of the President Bush, the younger one. But who's that guy behind the former President Bush? And a lot of you will probably say, well, I think it's probably the guy that was the vice president. Maybe you can't remember the name. Yeah, that must be who it is. Oh, now all of a sudden I'm drawing a blank. I knew it just a second ago. Oh, that's right. Cheney, that was his name, right? Now, in fact, this is not President Bush and the Vice President Dick Cheney. This is actually, look closer, it's actually President Bush and President Bush again. They've done a Photoshop trick, simply taken his face, pasted some glasses on, changed up the hairline, and yeah. Now, why this illusion? This again relates to the relationship between these two types of processing. When we first look at it and just pick out that pattern, there stands the president who always stands behind him, oh, the vice president, of course, Adam must be the vice president. What we are prone to when we use top-down processing is to potentially make some errors where the details are critical. So top-down processing has the advantage, it's quick and it's easy, but the disadvantage is where the details matter, we're more apt to make an error. Now, on the other hand, when we looked at it a little closer and again began analyzing the detail using this bottom-up processing, then we were able to actually figure out that, hey, this is really not two different people. It's actually the same person. Notice here, we were less apt to make an error, but it took much more time and effort to come up with that. Okay, so that's the advantages, disadvantages of each. So depending upon the situation, is going to depend upon what level of complexity we're going to go into. Are we going to go into the details or the surface patterns? A case in point, driving a car down the street. Are we going to use primarily bottom-up processing or top-down? Well, we've got to use top-down processing because we don't have that much time to identify what those other things on the street are, right? If you were trying to do bottom-up processing and look at all the details of everything in the roadway, including each car and motorcycle and bicycle, you wouldn't have enough time to respond to it. So that's what top-down processing is important. Now, on the other hand, if there was a maniac on the loose driving a car and we hear over the radio or nowadays on our phone that, oh, there's a maniac going around, the license plate number is such and such, now using some bottom-up processing and looking at the details of those license plates might actually make some sense, right? So each of it has its place. Okay, so now let's look at perceptual organization. And so psychologists in the early 1900s were interested in just how do we actually organize sensory information. So these psychologists identified that the way we do this, we identify the various forms, patterns, and whole objects by using certain rules of perceptual organization. Now, we don't do this consciously. It all happens at an automatic level for us. By the way, they call these psychologists the Gestalt psychologists. Gestalt means a form or pattern. So as they studied in how do we organize and make sense of information, one of the conclusions they made was the whole is greater than the sum of each part. So when we look at an object, the whole object that we identify has greater meaning than just each individual part of that thing, okay? So as we do this, we're going up the scale of meaning as we assemble the various forms, patterns, and objects. So one of the things that we use is to identify figure and ground relationships. So the figure would be the actual object that we're looking at visually. The ground is what we might refer to as the background, okay? So here's an example of this. Now, if we're looking at this picture, if we decide that the ground, the background is the white part, okay, if we decide that's the ground or background, then what figure are we going to see? Somebody saw it already? Yeah, we're going to see there's two faces looking at each other here. Now, on the other hand, we're more likely to look at this and decide that the darker part is the ground, the background, and then in that case, we're going to identify the figure as being this vase. And there's some things that tip us off to that as well. You know, there's markings on it and such. Okay, but notice, yeah, it depends upon what you choose as ground or background. And here's another example. So what do we have here? Is it, well, this could be people walking downstairs maybe, or could be arrows. So which is it? And we could sit here all day and argue about which is it and so forth. But in fact, in this particular situation, once again, it depends upon how you interpret figure and ground. So if you interpret the figure as being the people, then, or if you interpret the, let's go with this, ground, let's call the people the ground, okay? If the people are the ground or background, then what you're gonna see as the objects, the figures is the arrows, and if you are seeing the arrows as the background, the white part is the background, then you see the people walking. Now, if you watch your own reactions very closely, you will find out that you cannot actually perceive people walking at the same time that you're perceiving arrows and vice versa. What you actually will do if you watch yourself closely enough, you'll find yourself flipping back and forth between those two things, but you can't really see both at the same time. I know you don't believe me, but try it. Spend a little time on it. And, yeah, you'll find out that's how it works. So once again, we have to choose. Now, this also applies to other things than visual stimuli. For example, how about auditory stimuli? Yeah, maybe you play a certain musical instrument, and when you listen to music, that musical instrument may be more of what you tend to pick out because it's important to you. And much of the other instrumental part of it may seem more to be background to you as you're listening to that particular instrument. Same kind of principle. This even goes to the level of ideas. So you may be having a discussion with a friend and disagree on some point, and your friend says, well, no, those things that you're saying there, that's not the important stuff. The important stuff is this. And you say, no, that thing, that's not important. This is important. Okay, so you are again looking at some of those details as being unimportant background and others as more important, and you happen to disagree as to what's background and what's the important information, and therefore you don't agree. Okay, so it even goes to that level. Now, we also use various principles of grouping they found in order to organize information, such as proximity. We tend to perceive things that are next to one another, close to one another, as being part of the same object. And so people, in looking at these lines here, noting that these are closer together and these and so on, they will tend to say, well, I see 3 pairs of lines rather than I see 6 separate lines. Now, this may go to other situations. For example, you're at the park and you see a lady there with some children who are near her most of the time. You may conclude that what? They go together. They belong together. And much of the time, you'd probably be right using this principle of proximity. Another principle of grouping that we use is we group things that are similar together. Okay, so in looking at this figure here, most people are going to look at that, and when you ask them what it is, they're going to say, well, there's a line of triangles, there's a line of dots, another line of triangles. Not too many people are going to look at that thing and say, well, I see a line with triangle, dot, triangle, and then there's another line, triangle, dot, dot. Yeah, we just don't do that, right? Yeah, we group things that are similar together. Once again, this might apply at the park as well. So maybe we see a lady there, and this time, even if they're not near her, there are some children that look similar to her. We might conclude that, well, maybe they're part of the same family. And again, much of the time we might be right. Okay, but not always. Okay. Next, we also group things according to the principle of continuity. So continuity is what? We like to see things as continuous whole objects rather than a bunch of fragments. So in looking at this figure and asking people to tell us how many things they see there, most people are going to say, well, I see 2 things. What do you see? Oh, I see a straight line and I see a wavy line. Most people will say something like that, 2 objects, right? It's rare the person who's going to say, well, I see a line segment and then I see an arc above another line segment, and then below following line segment, there's an arc below that. You just don't do that unless you're maybe a geometry teacher, right? We like to see things as not a bunch of fragments, but continuous objects. And this goes to even sometimes what makes horror movies scary. Yeah, where things that should be part of a continuous object are not. I'll soften it a little bit. You know, if we take baby monkeys or we take very young children and we show them a piece of paper that has various parts of a face all scattered rather than organized into an actual face, you know, just a nose here and an eye there and mouth over there and that kind of thing. They get really disturbed when you show them that. You know, why is that? Because they're not part of that continuous object that we want to see. It's disturbing to us that those body parts are not connected in the way they should be. Okay. Okay. Then there is also the principle of connectedness. So where there are stimuli that appear to be connected, we assume them to be part of the same object. So when we show people this diagram here, most people will say, well, I see 3 objects, 3 dumbbells or something like that, right? There's very few people who are going to say, well, I see 6 dots and 3 lines. Now, you just don't do that, right? Because you assume these things are all part of one thing. They're part of that. So again, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Again, that's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. thing. Okay, one other that I want to show you is the principle of closure. So when you look at this, what do you see in the picture? If you look at it a moment, you'll identify that there is a cube there. You see it? See anything else? Now you can see the cube actually a couple different ways and shift how it is oriented visually if you mess around with it mentally. But yeah, most readers say, oh, I don't see any other kind of thing. So why do we actually see a cube here? We shouldn't be seeing that because there is nothing. There are no sides here where I'm moving my cursor. There's no lines here. So the object is not really there. Oh, and there's no lines here either. But yet we mentally see them. Our brain is filling in missing parts of the object. Why is it filling in missing parts of this cube? Well, because the cube has some meaning to us. If we didn't interpret it that way, we'd have to say, well, I don't know, I see some dots with some, I don't know, lines through them, missing parts. We don't have a word for these kind of objects, and each of them is different anyways. And they're all separate objects rather than being part of one more meaningful object, that of a cube. So our brain invents the missing parts. This is what we call closure. Closure is really important to us. If we didn't have this capability, when parts of things were hidden, we would be very freaked out. And I always give the example in class of, you know, if I'm looking at the class from the front, if I didn't have this capability of closure to mentally fill in the missing parts, I would think, oh my God, there's all these people and their legs and part of their body is missing. No, it's not. Actually, it's just what the tables and desks are just covering up part of their body, and my brain fills in the missing parts so I don't freak out. So this all leads to helping us interpret when sometimes illusions occur, like this one. You're looking at that guy there, you say, what in the world? At first it looks okay, but then you look a little closer and you say, something's not right with this thing. This thing is impossible to actually exist. Well, you'll understand better if I show you how it looks from a different angle. See what's happened? Oh, yeah. So what's happened is our brain has filled in missing parts here to see some of these boards as continuous objects, or to perceive them as continuous objects even though they're not. So closure is involved, and also continuity and wanting to see these things unconsciously, wanting to see them as continuous objects and so forth. So let's get that illusion. Now, most of the time, these principles of organizing sensory information work pretty well. So they give us a pretty good idea of what's actually there in our environment. But yeah, once in a while, there will be something that produces this illusion and fools our systems. So, okay, now a specific kind of perception is depth perception. Depth perception is the ability to be able to estimate how close or far away something is. Is it moving towards us or away? Much of this we do through the use of binocular cues. The information we're using is both eyes, and we're analyzing the input from both eyes to enable us to do this. So one of the ways that we do this, one binocular cue, is that of retinal disparity. Okay, retina is what? The sheet of tissue at the back of our eyeball that contains the receptors for vision, and that's where the light particles fall from objects that are in our environment. And disparity is a difference. Okay, so what's retinal disparity? Each eye gets a slightly different picture of the scene. And you can easily illustrate this. If you take your finger, go ahead and do this, take your finger and hold it right up to your nose and then close one eye. And you'll notice your finger comes out in the extreme one side of your visual field. Now switch eyes, leave your finger there, switch eyes, and lo and behold, in the other eye, your finger is in the opposite side of your visual field. Each eye is getting a different image. So if you open both eyes, that tells your brain that, oh, this thing is very close because the two pictures are very different in terms of where your finger is. Now, if you move your finger out further and hold it out and then switch back and forth between eyes, then you'll see, yes, it does appear to be in a slightly different position with each eye, but the difference is much less. And so our brain will then, using both eyes, interpret that thing to be somewhat further away, not so close to our nose anymore. So that's retinal disparity. The other that we use is convergence. And you can easily illustrate this if you have a friend take an object like a pencil and hold it out at arm's length, and then have them keep their eyes focused on it as they bring it closer to their face and up against their face, and then back out again to arm's length and back and forth. And what you will find is their eyeballs will converge. Converge means to angle together. And so the closer it is, again, the more the eyeballs angle together, converge. Our brain, again, analyzes that convergence of the eyeballs to give us a sense of how close or far away the thing is. Now, in fact, those systems work pretty well most of the time. However, if you've ever tried this little trick and you hold your fingers out like they're showing in this diagram, and then you move them a little closer and further away from your face, eventually you'll get to a point where you get this illusion. I call it the finger sausage. I don't know if that's a real term or if I just made that up, where you'll see this floating part of a finger. That illusion is because this fools that binocular system. Once you get that going, just close one eye and you'll notice, yeah, the finger sausage disappears. So again, this works well most of the time, but it has its limitations. Now, we also use many monocular cues for depth perception as well. Monocular, these are cues that we can perceive just with one eye open. They're also evident if we're looking at two-dimensional representations like a photo, a movie on a screen, a picture on a piece of paper. These are operative even in those situations. So here's a whole list of them. I'll kind of review each of them real quickly, and then we'll look at some examples of them as well. So first on our list, interposition. Interposition is where one object blocks another object. We assume that the object that is blocking the other thing is closer. The thing that is being blocked must be further away. And you go, duh, anybody knows that? Well, all you have to know is that's what they call interposition. Then there's relative size. If we know roughly the size of something, if it appears larger, if it makes a larger image on our retina, then we assume it to be closer. If the image on our retina is smaller, then we assume it to be further away. Then there's relative height. So looking in our field of view, if the object is low in our field of vision, then we assume it to be close. If it's higher up in our visual field, we assume it to be further away. That applies at least below the horizon. Once you get above the horizon, up into the sky, the whole thing reverses. I never noticed that until I learned about this, but yeah, it's really true. And I always, when we're in the classroom, I'll tell the students, so from my perspective, the students in the front row are lower in my visual field than the ones in the back row. Therefore, I perceive the ones in the front to be closer than the ones in the back. Okay. Then there's relative motion. So this is as we are in a moving vehicle, we will find things that are closer to us appear to pass much more rapidly than those things that are in the distance. It's also known as motion parallax. We'll see an actual example of that in a minute. Then there's linear perspective. Maybe if you took art appreciation, you learned about that one. Linear perspective, I like to call it the railroad track phenomenon. You know, if you're looking at the railroad tracks going off into the distance, it looks as if those railroad tracks are narrowing and eventually coming to a point in the distance. Now, we know that's not true. You know, that just shows us that those things are going off into the distance. And the same is true of, say, large buildings. The walls appear to angle as they get, further into the distance and so on. We'll see some example of that as well. And then light and shadow also gives us some indication of distance and the surface of objects, whether it might be indented or protruding. So here's an example. This guy says, has no depth perception. And he's confused. Is there a cop standing on the corner, or does she have a tiny person in her hair? Now you say, oh, of course he should know better. There's no such thing as a tiny cop, right? Okay. So what particular monocular depth cue is he lacking that he can't pick that out? Well, one we might say is relative size. We know how large a person is, and so no person can be actually that small. It must be further away, can't be right there in her hair. Students also pointed out to me that relative height ought to come into play too. And the fact that this person is higher in their visual field than, say, this guy here also would indicate that they were somewhat further away. And thirdly, my students pointed out, I hadn't even noticed, that interposition comes into play. She's actually covering up part of the police officer, and so that suggests to us that they're further away. So you get a whole bunch of them actually there. Now here we have an odd picture. As you look at this, what's wrong with it? What depth cue, monocular depth cue, has the artist messed around with? Yeah, there are things here that you shouldn't be able to see that you do see, and there's things that should be blocking other people, other things that are not blocking them. Like this tree ought to be blocking this person, right? Yeah, and so they've messed around with this interposition depth cue. I don't know if you like it. I don't like it that much, but maybe you do. But yeah, okay. How about this one? What gives this illusion that this is a very large freight elevator? Okay. How about linear perspective? Notice, whoops, sorry, hit the cursor. Notice the lines angling together, suggesting that these lines of lights here in the ceiling are going off into the distance. The walls are going off into the distance. And as again, one of my students pointed out, oh, there's also relative size. Look how small the man or lady here is in reference to the ceiling. It must be very tall as well. Okay, so relative size and linear perspective. Here's an illustration of the relative motion example. Give you a chance to go back here and refresh your memory on these. Okay, so as the lady's in a moving vehicle, I don't know, is it a bus or train, whatever, as she is riding here, the items that are very close on the shoulder of the road appear to pass very rapidly, whereas those that are further away, like the house, not as rapidly. Things in the very distance may appear to pass very, very slowly. So that's, again, a matter of relative motion. And relative to each other, they appear to be passing at different rates of speed. Now, this also illustrates something else that maybe you've run into, and that is the illusion of motion phenomenon. Okay. Um, Maybe you've had the experience of waiting in a bus, parked next to another bus, waiting to go somewhere, and anticipating the bus taking off. And then all of a sudden, everybody cheers, and it suddenly stops when everyone also realizes that your bus is not moving, it's the other one that's moving. Pretty weird sensation if you've had it. I actually had this happen to me in the parking lot at HEB. I got in my vehicle and I started it up and I put it in gear, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, the car is moving even though I got my foot on the brake. So I pressed harder and it still seemed to keep moving. And then I realized the person next to me was backing out of the space. It wasn't me moving. Why does this happen? Here's the reason. Your brain picks out certain items that it assumes are fixed points, that it assumes don't move. And so if your fixation point actually starts moving, you may have the illusion that it was you for a moment before you realize that, oh, that's that other thing that's moving. Now, a house is a pretty good thing for your brain to pick out as a fixation point. It's not likely to move, but sometimes other vehicles do. And that's why that illusion that we talked about may happen sometimes. Okay, here we have some shapes here, and you notice that the shading gives a sense of how far away the items are on the surface of that ball. So we'll go into a lot of detail on that. You'll also notice that many pictures that you see incorporate many different monocular cues. And this painting, for example, you can see the linear perspective with the street appearing to narrow and the top line of the buildings also converging in the distance. You can notice also the interposition, like this building covering up part of that tree, or the tree covering up part of the mountain in the distance. And so that gives a sense of it. You can see the relative size of the people in the foreground larger than the ones that are apparently further away. And you can see the relative height example too, because these people being higher in your field of vision appear to be further away. Another thing that lends to this also is the atmospheric perspective. And you notice that colors become more dim and muted, and lines become a bit more blurry as you get into the distance. Things are sharper as they're closer. So that's another one we can talk about. There's actually many different depth cues. Okay, so that's depth perception. Another ability that we have is perceptual constancy. And so we recognize objects to be the same even when some aspect of their appearance has changed. We're not fooled by the change in appearance. We know the object is the same. And here are some examples of that. Size constancy, that's a type of perceptual constancy. So as we see a person approaching, let's say we're on campus and we see a person in the distance across the street, and their image is very tiny as they're far away. As they approach us, the image grows and grows and grows until it fills most of our field of view when they're right in front of us. Now, we don't say, oh my God, there's a tiny person that's growing to enormous size. We don't do that. We recognize that, that's the same size person. They're just further away. Now they're getting closer. And so this size and distance relationship doesn't fool us. Now, here are some size constancy illusions, actually. Here's a situation where something actually fools our perceptual system. I like A, the one on the left, because it's actually from the first computer game I ever played. Yeah, pretty primitive, right? When you look at the two monsters, it's quite obvious that the monster here in the back, if you will, is much larger, right? But if you were to measure these, in fact, you could stop your computer, you can measure these things. These two monsters are exactly the same size, but for the life of me, I can't help but see this one as being bigger, even though it's the same size as this one. Now, why is it that this one in the back looks bigger? Well, there's all sorts of depth cues that tell us that it's further away. You've got the linear perspective, you've got the relative height. Um, so our brain says, we got two images, one of them close, further away. The images are both the same size, but the one's further away. The one that's further away must actually, in reality, be bigger. And so our brain actually interprets it that way. Isn't that crazy? Same thing on this one on the right. So again, I don't know about you, but yeah, for the life of me, I cannot see this box here in the upper part of the illustration as being the same size as that one, but it is the same size. It just appears to be further away. And so that illusion. If you ever get a chance to see this one, this is the Ames illusion. You look through this little peephole here, and people in this room then look very weird because when they're over on the left side of the room, they appear to be very tiny. When they walk to the right side of the room, they appear to grow to gigantic proportions. And you think, how can this be? Well, again, it's an illusion because as they move to the right side of the room, they're closer to you, so the image is larger, and also the roof slopes down so that relative to the height of the room, they're taller, thus giving that illusion of growing and getting smaller as they move back and forth. So if you ever get to a place where you can actually view that illusion, do it, it's worth it. It's very fascinating. Here's an example of shape constancy, another type of perceptual constancy. So if you're looking at a door straight on, forms a rectangular image on the retina. If the door is opened, the image is really no longer rectangular. Notice that now you've got a, what is it, parallelogram? I don't know. Geometry's been a long time ago, but it's not rectangular. So are we fooled by that? Do we go, oh my God, the door changed shape? Nah, we know that it's the same door. It's no different than before. It's now being seen from a different angle. So we're not fooled by that. And you say, well, duh, that's silly, but consider if we didn't have these capabilities, we'd be constantly confused about things in our environment. So we move on to perceptual adaptation. This is the ability of our perceptual system to adjust to changes in our sensory abilities and sensory system. Now, the extreme example is what happened when George Stratton, an instructor, psychology instructor, had his students to wear distortion goggles for several days. He got some students to do this for extra credit, and the goggles actually caused images to invert and be upside down. So when the students first put on the goggles, they had a lot of trouble. They literally had to have people lead them around because it just disoriented them so badly. But after wearing them constantly for several days, they were able to function normally. And after several days, everything appeared to be right side up. They were able to throw and catch balls. They were able to even drive cars just in the college parking lot, but they were able to do it. What had happened? Their perceptual systems had adapted to that change in sensory input and literally inverted it. Now, once they took the goggles off, guess what happened? Everything upside down again. Luckily, they were able to readjust to normal much more quickly, having recently gone through that process and sort of their brain sort of learned what to do to readjust. I'm thinking, boy, they must have been really badly in need of extra credit to actually do that for an extra credit project, right? But illustrates this. But here's where this maybe comes into play. Suppose that you wear glasses and something, bends your glasses a bit so they're a bit crooked. Well, at first it's kind of disorientating, but if you keep wearing them, you sort of adjust to it, right? And you get used to it. And so you're fine again after a bit. And then, of course, once you get them straightened out, then all of a sudden everything's out of whack for a little bit and then it's back to normal. Now, this also comes into play with our sense of hearing. And so people sometimes gradually lose their hearing and they're not aware of it. Why not? Because their brain, again, is constantly adjusting the volume that they're perceiving. So to them, everything seems as loud as before. They don't know that they're actually missing a lot of sounds that they're no longer able to pick up. So in this case, it sort of has worked against them. So now let's look at the influence of perceptual sets and what they do in terms of our perception. So perceptual set is something that it sets an expectation that steers us towards a certain interpretation of things. So here's one. I haven't done that with you. So I want you to do something. I want you to spell the word silk with me. Spell it out loud. Okay, so say the letters along with me. All right, S-I-L-K. Did you do it? Let's do it again. S-I-L-K. Can you do it a little faster? S-I-L-K. What do cows drink? If you were playing along, you might have blurted out milk. But do cows drink milk? No, cows drink water. Only calves drink milk. Yeah. So what happened? I used a perceptual set to alter the word that you accessed to answer the question. So I had you spell a word that ended in ILK. And then when I asked you a question to which the answer was a liquid, the first thing that your mind pulls up is going to be milk because it has ILK at the end. Okay, now if you waited and you thought it through, yeah, you may not have experienced that, but if you blurted it out right away, that's very common. So perceptual set steers us towards a certain interpretation. Let me give you another example. Okay, I'm going to say a number of things, and then I'm going to flash something on the screen. There's going to be a figure in a box. And when I've done that, I want you, again, as soon as you see that thing, blurt out what you saw in the box. Okay, what did you see in the box? So ready? Okay. So remember, I'm just going to flash it for a brief millisecond after I tell you some stuff. 15, 19, 17, 14, 16, 18. Okay. Now, what did you end up saying? Okay, here's where having a whole class is really helpful. When I show this to a class, and I've given them a list of teen numbers, teen numbers like I just gave you. there will be more students in that class that will blurt out 13. Okay. In classes, though, where I read a list of letters, like, you know, X, Z, P, Q, whatever, then majority of students will blurt out the letter B. And so again, what we have done is we've produced an expectation. If we precede that with a list of letters, an expectation that a letter is going to come up on the screen, teen numbers, going to be a teen number. So notice our perceptions influenced by our expectations, preconceptions. This is the power of perceptual sets. So expectation effects were also shown in experiments such as the one that's illustrated here. They had participants to look at either this, the man with playing an instrument, or this picture on the right, the woman, picture of obviously a woman. Then each participant saw this middle screen. So what did they identify as being in this middle screen when they saw that? It depended upon what they saw first. If they had seen the picture of the woman first, they tended to see a woman here and say, oh, it just doesn't have as much detail. If they happened to see the man with the instrument, when they saw this one, they tended to say, man with an instrument again, just not as detailed. Interestingly, they were often unable to identify the other interpretation once they had seen one of the distinct interpretations. If they had seen the man with the instrument first and being shown this one, they say man with an instrument, well, what else could it be? Often they were unable to pick out the image of the woman's face. So one thing to take away from that is when we have interpreted a stimulus one particular way, we may be unable to see other possibilities. Yeah, that really comes into effect when we're having, say, a discussion with someone and you have one idea that you've held for a long time and they come up with a different idea. You may not be able to really see their point because, again, you've been blinded by what preconceived ideas, okay? Now, this also, effects of expectation also showed up in this very odd experiment that was done by these researchers, Brunner and Postman, back in the 1920s or 1930s, I always forget. Anyways, what they did is they had this bogus set of cards made up in which the suits were reversed such that the hearts and the diamonds were in black and the spades and the, yeah, what is the other suit? I haven't played cards much lately. What is it? The spades and the, oh gosh, you know, the other ones, the things are black, right? Oh my gosh. I'm not going to redo the whole video for that. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. All right. So anyways, what they did is they then had subjects in their experiment to sit there and identify cards as they were brought up on screen. And sometimes the cards were normal cards. Sometimes they were these bogus cards. They observed a number of things very interesting in this. They found that, first of all, people were able to identify the cards much more quickly when they were normal, regular cards. When the color of the suits were reversed, it took them longer to identify the card. They were actually tracking how many milliseconds it took for them to respond. Secondly, they found that people also, they got really fatigued and tired when they were being presented with many of the bogus cards consecutively, which they didn't get fatigued like this, just identifying normal cards. And people got tired when they were presenting all these bogus cards. They said, yeah, are we almost done? Is it almost over? Can we quit? Things like that. They didn't say that when they were just looking at the normal cards. Thirdly, very oddly, none of the participants noticed that the bogus cards had the color of the suits reversed. They actually asked the participants, did you notice anything odd about any of the cards? And they all said no. We didn't notice anything odd, except for one guy. He did say this. He said, yes, I noticed that on the Queen of Hearts, the heart had a little black outline around it. Yeah, he noticed there was something different, but even he didn't see that the whole heart was actually black. He just saw a hint of the bogus color there. And so what can also occur is when we have a certain expectation, when we encounter something different, sometimes we don't even recognize that it's different. We see what we expected to see sometimes rather than what was actually there. Really quite interesting. So all of this then relates to advertising. What's advertising supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to create an expectation that you're going to enjoy a product, right? That product is going to do something, make you feel a certain way or do something good for you. And so in advertising, the whole thing is managing the expectations of people so that they'll want that product. So this was illustrated in the effects of advertising on kids. Researchers did an experiment with kindergarten kids. Their moms and dads had given them permission to be in the experiment. And the researchers got some carrots, washed them up, put them in Ziploc bags. Half of the carrots, Ziploc bags. Half of the carrots were packaged in McDonald's wrappers. Same old carrots. They had the kids to try each kind of carrot, right? McDonald's carrots and the Ziploc bag carrots. Then they asked each child independently, without the others hearing the others' answers, which carrots taste better. Vast majority of the kids said, oh, the McDonald's carrots taste much better. Now, same old carrots, right? What was it that fooled them? Of course, it was the packaging. The packaging raised expectations from advertising that, oh, this is something special, this is something that's going to be really good, so on, and sort of fooled them. So, of course, we adults aren't fooled by things like that, are we? Well, it turns out, yes, we are. Maybe you've heard of the old Pepsi challenge where they would ask people what's their preference, Coke or Pepsi, and then they would have them to sample Coke or Pepsi. But sometimes it was in the cup that said the opposite of what it was supposed to be. And again, often if people were told it was their favorite, if the cup told them they were drinking their favorite, they'd say, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's right. It tastes better. And then when they were told, oh, well, you're not drinking Coke, you're drinking Pepsi or vice versa, they were like, nah, that can't be. And so they really weren't able to tell the difference in the taste as much as they thought. They were actually misled again by the way the thing was being delivered. And so that illustrates that. And this also goes to even vehicles, you know. So, what's better, Toyota or Lexus? And everybody said, oh, well, Lexus is much better. But then you find out that, well, mechanically speaking, they're really the same thing. But what is it? The price is different. and the advertising shows the Lexus to be luxury, and so it sort of tries to make us think that it's better when mechanically speaking it's the same. Um, this also applies to medications. Interestingly, they found that the same medication tended to work better. The results were reported as being better by patients if they had to pay more money for it. The more money they had to pay, the better they reported it working. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, so boy, I don't know. Free medication. Well, anyways, notice how expectation influences us. Now, there's a word I should put on the screen. Let me see if I could draw it. I forgot to put it on here. If I could do this, I'm going to try. Here's our word, which you can't see. Oh, oh gosh. Let me see if I can do this. How come I can't see it? Let me try to. Okay. I'm going to halfway cover up our pictures, but you can sort of see them. Okay. There it is. Let's talk about the influence of schema. That's how you pronounce that word. Schema is sort of our worldview, how we think things in the real world work. It might be applied to particular aspects or just our overall worldview of things. So schema, how we think things work. Okay. So here in the picture, if you are one who believes that, hey, there could be all sorts of mythical creatures that have not yet been fully discovered, and you're showing the picture A here, and you're told, well, this picture was taken in Loch Ness. You might say, oh, yeah, look, there's the Loch Ness monster. There's Nessie. See, there's the hump, and there's the head over here. Now, if you're one that doesn't believe in that kind of stuff, you'd say, it just looks like maybe some rocks or something in a stick. You're going to see it differently. Or how about the one on the right? Yeah, if you see this picture and you're one of those people that says, oh, you know, there are the space aliens coming down in spaceships, and look, there's a photo. There they are. But if you don't believe in that stuff, you're going to say, well, I'm not sure what it is, but it's can't be that. And then maybe you look a little closer and you say, you know what? Actually, it's just some really weird cloud formations, which is actually exactly what it was. But how you see the world and what you think is possible also influences expectations. And I always think about, I used to like to watch this show where they were looking for Bigfoot. Do you ever watch that show? Or maybe you saw that back in the day. And they're always looking for the Bigfoot monster, the Sasquatch, you know. They never find him, but these people truly believe that that monster is there. So almost anything that they encounter, they see that as a sign that it's nearby. You know, just any rock or any noise. And I remember in one episode, they decided that they're gonna set a trap for the Bigfoot. They were gonna catch Bigfoot in a trap. So they got this big fancy trap made up out of brush and bushes and logs and whatnot. Um, and then they went away and came back the next morning, and lo and behold, the trap had fallen. And one guy says, "Yeah, son of a bitch is in there. I know he's in there. I can smell him." And so they go and they lift up the top of the trap, and guess what? They caught one of their own guys. So anyway, so much for finding the Bigfoot, right? But notice that, yeah, when you have a certain schema, that you will tend to interpret things along the lines of that schema, sometimes when that's not really the way it is. Um, so how you think the world is matters. Okay. Oh, by the way, I finally got tired of watching the show because they'd never find him. And so finally I said, you know, just let me know when you find him. And they have, as far as I know, they haven't. Okay. Oh, The schema is still on the screen. Can I remove it? Where's the eraser? Let's see if I can get it off of here. Oh, yes, there we go. Hey, it's working. Almost. Okay. The context in which we see things also influences how we perceive them. If you look at this illustration here, which line appears to be longer, the black line or the blue line? And most people say, well, the black line looks longer. Why does it look longer? It's not longer. It's exactly the same as the blue one. It looks longer because the context, the surroundings are different. So context affects perception. Here's some other examples of context effects. We saw this one already. The context in which you saw this, president must be the vice president, led us to maybe mistakenly conclude who was actually in the picture. Or here's another example. If you see rabbits climbing into the box from below, it then gives you the sense that the box is kind of hanging from the ceiling, more or less. On the other hand, if you see them climbing in from floor level, then it gives you the sense that the box is on the floor. So the context of what's going on when you encounter something influences your interpretation of it. Or how about this one, where there's a missing sound in a sentence, you know, like somebody's speaking and you kind of miss part of a word. If what you hear is the eel is on the wagon, you probably figure out that the person probably said the wheel is on the wagon. If the sentence, though, had been the eel is on the orange, and yeah, that word that you didn't hear all of is probably going to be what? Peel. You probably kind of figure that out based on the context, and you'll perceive that to be peel instead of wheel. Here's an example of context as well. So two basketball players, how short is the little guy? Is he as short as I am? Nobody's that short. Actually, the little guy is 6'5". Why does he look so short? Well, he's right next to, I don't know if any of you know this guy. He's not playing anymore. That's Yao Ming, a very tall basketball player. I think he was like 7'50" or something like that. Very tall. And so next to him, this tall guy looks short. Context matters. Turns out that even culture is a context that influences perception. And this card, this picture card here, helps us to illustrate this. So they showed this picture card to people from two different groups. They showed the picture card, first of all, to Americans, asked them, what do you see here? And most Americans said, well, it looks like a family sitting around in their living room. Okay, well, what's this? Well, that's a corner of the room, of course, right? And what's this over here? Oh, that's a window, of course. And you probably agree, being an American, right? Or from our part of the world. Now, they also showed the same card to people who were part of a tribal group in Africa that lived in rounded huts and spent most of their time outdoors. So what did they see in the picture? Well, they said, well, it looks like a family sitting around. They agreed with that, with the Americans on that, but from there it got very different. And when they pointed to this, what's that? They said, oh, well, obviously that's a tree. Oh, well, what about this thing then? And they said without any hesitation, well, that's a metal box. He said, what, a metal box? Yeah, it was obvious to them because in their cultural group, women would carry loads around by placing them in a metal box and balancing them on their heads. I guess it's very efficient when you get good at it. So there was no doubt in their minds. Okay, so notice that how we interpret things is even influenced by our cultural background And that really says something when you happen to interact people from different cultural groups, especially if they're very different from yours. It's very important that you understand what perspective they're coming from. It's very important that you understand how they perceive things and how they think, because it might be very different from how we do. Okay, so let's just sum up. Biological influences on perception include our analysis of sensory information. Oops, unlearned sensory abilities. We'll get to that in a minute. Critical period for sensory development. I might mention that, didn't mention it before. So we need input in our sensory systems at specific critical periods of time in order for that sensory system to develop correctly. For example, baby kittens, that they covered up their eyes during a certain period of time shortly after they were born. Having no visual input during that time, the visual cortex in their brains didn't develop properly. So these kittens then, even after they took the blinders off, had difficulty estimating how close they were to objects, depth perception, and even kind of figure ground relationships. So that's an example that obviously suggests also with us humans, if we have any sensory deficits, like a visual problem, that we correct it as soon as we can in a child's life. Okay, psychological influences, Gestalt principles of organizing information that we saw, learned schemas, the effects of the context and perceptual set, and then social cultural influences are cultural assumptions and expectations. Okay, so let's just tack on a couple other things. More recent experiments have also identified how emotions, our physical state, and our motivations influence perception as well. And here's some examples. When you're tired, you will estimate a destination to be further away than if you were estimating that when you were refreshed. In experiments, subjects estimated a target to be further away when given a heavy crossbow as opposed to a lighter one. In experiments also, when people were estimating how steep a hill was, they estimated that it was steeper when they were wearing a heavy backpack as opposed to a light backpack or none at all. And they also estimated it to be steeper if they had listened to sad music, as opposed again to happy or no music at all. And they also estimated the hill to be steeper if they were walking alone as opposed to walking with others. So kind of our emotional state, physical state, also something you desire looks closer as well. So that makes it kind of interesting. Okay, last topic we have then is extrasensory perception, and that kind of goes back to what they had here on this chart here, unlearned sensory abilities. Okay, so extrasensory perception, sometimes abbreviated ESP, this would involve an ability to receive information about things through means other than our normal sensory systems. Okay, so to be able to see something at such a great distance that there's no way you could visually see it, and so forth. Okay, so some examples of the type of phenomenon that would fall in this category might be what? That feeling of being stared at, you know. I think probably most of us have had that at one time or another. Gosh, I think somebody's watching me. Maybe you turn around and it's nothing. But maybe you turn around and there is someone looking at you, and then you start to wonder, did I know that somehow without again, a normal means of identifying that, or was that just a coincidence? Other examples would be telepathy, which would be the ability to send or receive information mentally from one person to another, or clairvoyance, which would be to identify objects and events remotely at a distance, in again, such a way that your normal sensory systems couldn't give you that information, or precognition. This would be an awareness of events that are not predictable before they actually occur, things that you could not normally predict. Or even presentiment, which would be to experience the emotional response to an event before the event, unpredictable again, actually occurred. So when we look at this whole concept of extrasensory perception, for the most part, what we will find is psychologists are skeptics when it comes to this. And for maybe some very good reasons. For one thing, uh, we will find that there are people who claim to have these sort of abilities, which, when tested, were not able to actually do what they said they could do. There were some frauds. And of course, it does go against any real scientific explanation that we have of how people might actually do this. So, because it's difficult to, if not impossible, to explain scientifically at this time, most psychologists are going to say, don't think it happens. Or someone will simply say, impossible. Okay. Now, there are a small minority of psychologists that might say, well, this is potentially possible. Um, those that do advocate this, and by the way, I'm one that does say I think there is a possibility that such abilities do exist. The reason that we would cite for that would be, for one thing, these type of experience have been reported by people of all cultural groups throughout all of history. Um, there have also been some very good experimentation that seem to, from time to time, suggest that this is possible. Okay. And so some of us are going to be open to the possibility of this. Um, Most psychologists, though, would be skeptical of such a thing. Now, in terms of some evidence that might suggest this possibility, we have to look to what's now called parapsychology. Whereas early psychologists like William James actually studied such abilities or advocated for the possibility of them. In psychology, these ideas sort of went the way of studying the unconscious once the behaviorists came along and said, let's only study things that we can directly measure and directly observe. And so those that did want to study this were marginalized and became known as parapsychologists. However, many experiments have been conducted within that field. Um, for example, Gansfeld experiments. Many of these have been done with meticulous care to prevent subjects from getting information any way other than by this extrasensory type of perception. In Gansfeld experiments, the subject is to receive some sort of information from another individual, and the two individuals would be separated by some distance. The person receiving the information would often be put into a soft upholstered chair, or maybe even an isolation tank where they couldn't get any touch information. There would be static played over headphones so that they couldn't get any auditory information, and their eyes would be covered, maybe something like ping pong balls cut in half covering their eyes, and so on, so that they couldn't get any meaningful visual information. so on and so forth. The person then who would be sending the information often was a great distance from that individual. Often this was also captured on video recordings to make sure that there was no cheating going on. Sometimes even both of the individuals, sender and receiver, were thousands of miles apart and placed in Faraday cages. Faraday cages being a device that can prevent any electromagnetic communication going on. So in a meta-analysis of many of these Ganzfeld experiments, some 700 sessions, 2 dozen researchers, where the chance guess rate was 25%, they found a 34% actual hit rate. Now, when these experiments were then examined by skeptics, many of them suspected sloppy procedures. They expected that maybe there was fraud involved, so they were asked to monitor experiments. And what they found is that even when a skeptic monitored the procedures, they frequently got similar results. They also found that the more tightly controlled the experiment was, the better the quality of the experiment, the greater the likelihood that they found an actual effect, as opposed to less well-controlled experiments. So that seemed to suggest that there was maybe something there. Other experiments that seem to suggest this possibility, random number generator experiments. Now, these, more of these have been done by physicists, pretty hard scientists. A random number generator is a device that will, will generate numbers at random, and they can actually test the output of these to see whether it is actually random, how close to random it is. And so in hundreds of thousands of trials in which people were told to try to, by intention, alter the output of these machines, they found the output changed from chance by about 1%. So when you look at that statistically, that's almost impossible to attribute to just chance variation. And fraud, also having been well-controlled experiments, doesn't seem to be a plausible explanation. It appears there is some ability that does exist, although it is very slight, apparently, okay, at least according to these experiments. So a few years back, in fact, a researcher named Beam was able to actually publish the results of his research in a major psychology journal, Feeling the Future, in which he did experiments where people actually they tracked their emotional responses to an event that had not yet occurred and found again an effect. Was questioned by critics and so forth. I guess what I want to kind of say is, my take on all this is that it looks like potentially there can be some ability like this, but if it does exist, it is probably, first of all, rather slight in our ability to actually alter things in this fashion, and probably also intermittent. In other words, you can't produce the phenomenon every time, which is kind of, to me, like in baseball. Every time the person gets up to the plate to bat, they don't always hit a home run. But that doesn't mean home runs don't exist. It just means they can't produce it every time that they're tested. So that's what I'm seeing there. But also realize most psychologists are just going to say, we don't believe it. We don't believe the evidence is good enough. And they will say, seems to be scientifically impossible. So that's where most of them are going to stand. All right, so enough. There we go. And that's going to conclude our session on perception. And so have a great day, and